morning, everyone, and delighted to be here. And linking in with the previous theme, I was up between 3 and 4 last night with my 11-month-old, so I'm definitely not having another baby. I'll be speaking to you for about 20 minutes around the kind of concepts of the co-benefits of climate change action. So how taking action on climate change can improve all of our lives, particularly by improving things like air pollution and air quality, and extending people's lives. So just to give a brief introduction to the Grantham Institute where I work. So we are a centre at Imperial College London focused on climate change and environment research. And my role, broadly speaking, is to help to go out of the university and talk to people about the science that's conducted at Imperial to communicate that in ways which hopefully are as accessible as possible. So just by way of context in terms of the importance of towns and cities. So in the UK, as you're probably aware, around 80% of the population live in urban areas. In terms of greenhouse gas emissions, 63 of the largest towns and cities in the UK, so that's those which have a population of over 130,000, account for almost half of the country's greenhouse gas emissions. And the wider context, and I think really positive story pretty much over the last 12 months, is a declaration of climate emergencies by councils around the country. Almost 2/3 of councils have now declared climate emergencies and set ambitious targets for becoming carbon neutral, zero carbon. And those kind of dates that have been set vary wildly, actually, between 2025 and 2050, but a really positive step forward in terms of towns and cities taking leadership role in taking action on climate change. So, and I think a lot of them, I think the key way in which we get this action is, and in terms of the way we take the public with us, is by thinking about how action on climate change links to the things that local people are most concerned about. And there are significant opportunities for both mitigating climate change, so reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but we also need to be very conscious as well. There's a proportion of climate change that's somewhat inevitable, so we need to be thinking about making decisions that reduce greenhouse gases while also making decisions that are providing a better level of adaptation to a future warmer climate, and I'll touch on that later. So Gail gave a really great summary of the 1.5 degree report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And so what's been done since, is that data has been brought down to a kind of a national level by a number of organisations. So the Met Office looked at the risk, the chance of a summer happening similar to that which we had in 2018. Which was, if you probably remember, a record-equaling summer at the time in terms of the length of the heat wave and how warm it was. So if we move to a world which is half a degree warmer than now, so a 1.5 degree rise in global temperatures, bearing in mind we've already increased global temperatures by 1 degree. If we do that, that summer that we had in 2018 will occur on average 1 in every 4 years. If we allow global temperatures to rise to 2 degrees, so 1 more degree Celsius, then that summer will be an average summer. And so you need to think about what that means for how well adapted our towns and cities are to a warmer climate in terms of the impact that has upon our infrastructure and how well adapted that is. And so I suppose the image on the left is illustrating some of the disruption that was caused in terms of the trains with buckling rails. On the right-hand side from the transport of the road network. So if we want to avoid lots of, I suppose in this case, middle-aged men taking their tops off, there's a good reason for taking action on climate change. So in terms of what we need to do to avoid this 1.5 degree rise in global temperatures, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, you may not be able to pick out all the points here, so I'll just, on the x-axis, you've got the dates going from 2010 through to 2100. And on the y-axis, you've got global emissions of carbon dioxide. So at the moment, we're emitting around 40 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide a year. If we are to avoid a rise in global temperatures of 1.5 degrees, 2 key things need to happen. We need to approximately halve global emissions by 2030 to reach a state of net zero by around 2050. So it's a very significant challenge. In terms of how the UK has done over the last 30 years, so this is data from the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, and it shows the different sectors of the economy and the carbon dioxide emissions from those sectors over the last 30 years. So the The red line is the power sector and is a real success story. So we've more than halved our emissions from electricity, particularly that comes into our houses, thanks to the growth of wind and solar. And also good to see yesterday the reversal of the policy. So onshore wind is back as an option, which is a positive step, albeit it shouldn't have happened in the first place. In the kind of maroon, browny colour is industry. So this partly reflects a decarbonisation of industry, but also reflects the fact that we have somewhat outsourced our manufacturing to other countries. And as was touched on earlier, we need to also be taking responsibility. We can't be blaming other countries for the things that we consume, which have come from other countries where those carbon dioxide emissions have been produced. But one of the key messages here is how comparatively stable some of the other sectors are. And it shows the kind of challenge that remains for a number of other sectors, particularly transport, where emissions have actually slightly increased, aviation, agriculture, in particular in terms of ones that have been historically harder to tackle. So bear in mind this next, to go back to that previous graph, the trajectory we need to go down in terms of decarbonisation is very steep. The key question then comes, how do we make sure that we are achieving those goals and achieving the objectives that organisations like Greenpeace and like Extinction Rebellion are calling for in terms of taking meaningful action on climate change, while also making sure we avoid what has been seen in Paris on the right-hand side here, the Gilets jaunes, in this case protesting against a climate-related tax on transport fuel. Well, a way to do this is to look at what the public are concerned about and talk about climate change in relation to other people's priorities, but also to think about how we can incorporate this into the decision-making process. So what this graph shows is data from Ipsos Mori, who do a representative survey of the UK public every month and ask an open-ended question, what are you most concerned about? And this graph shows the level of concern over the last 13 years. And so people can say more than one thing that they're concerned with, which is why you'll see that the different things don't all add up to 100%. And so what you'll see, so you've got the economy. It's a particular issue of concern following the economic crisis. The grey line, which obviously stands out, is those people concerned with the EU or Brexit, which I suppose messages that people didn't actually really care about it until the referendum was forced on us. The NHS, which is at pretty high levels of concern at the moment. And the other key thing is this dotted line. So this is members of the public who are concerned with pollution or the environment. So about a year ago, we put together this paper, and a key message was that we need to talk about climate change in relation to these other key priorities like the NHS as a way to bring climate change in the kind of narrative. But what we've seen over the last year, thanks to people like Greta, is there's quite a astonishing increase in levels of concern with pollution and the environment, to the extent that January, it was the third most important issue of concern for the UK public. So there's clearly a mandate there for more action on climate change from people across the country.